there, and welcome to this week's edition of Women in the Fore, right here on Times TV with me.
Puts people in jail. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think advancing along the way, because I lost my mother when I was 10 years old, then she became my greatest motivator. And I think because through her death and subsequently my father's death, I then became more exposed to inequalities in society, issues around, and issues around how privileged I was growing up. And then, you know, when things change and then you realize you don't have everything at your disposal.
Yes.
And then your eyes actually open up and you see how the mere fact of where you were born and to whom you were born will affect your access to opportunities.
Yes.
So I think from that stage, then it just changed for me completely, and just knowing where my mother came from and how she was able to overcome those barriers at that time as a woman. She became at some point I was told that she was the district commissioner of Zoma. She was the first woman in the early 80s to actually have done that.
Wow.
So I remember just saying, okay, I want to break those barriers, but I also want to make sure that it's a more equitable society, especially for those that are most disadvantaged. So right now, from then to now, my mother, Febi Mshisha, is actually my greatest inspiration.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love that. So tell me about what you alluded to, the fact that you started to recognize how there's such a disparity between different people in Malawi, and how others are more privileged purely because of where they were born or the family they were born into. How did that impact you? And perhaps, do you want to elaborate more on that?
Yeah, I think that really, and I think I look at it as a blessing in disguise. You know, of course, it's a painful period, and when I think about it, I wouldn't want anybody to go through a stage of losing their parents, even though I know many children in Malawi go through that. But I think it was a blessing in disguise because I was living in my bubble. And, you know, when you are protected as a child, and obviously because, you know, she died and my father subsequently, when I was still young, you know, it was very easy. You did good, you know, you worked hard in spite of the fact that you lost your parents. But I always say I was still born in privilege, and that gave me an early start.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's an interesting way of looking at it,
exactly.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Because I always say that, you know, inequalities start even at the time when you are in your mother's womb, based on what your mother is eating, you know.
This is true.
Exactly.
This is true.
The science actually confirms that even brain development and everything, if your mother is not having nutritious diet and all that, by the time the child is born, you're already having a child who would not be as, you know, robust as maybe a child that has gone through a mother who's had nutritious diet and all that. So I always say that the fact that I kick-started early with my parents being able to afford me good early education, speaking English coherently at the time, so even at the time that they were dying, I was, I think, way ahead from the majority of many of our young children in the rural areas, but even in the urban areas, who just start from going to, they don't even go to nursery for many of them. They just go to standard 1 and they're in a class of 80 and 100.
Is that even possible? Can you just sort of skip nursery? Is that possible?
Actually, I think the Ministry of Gender, if not education, are really enshrining that it's important to have early childhood development, and they're trying to put
this is a true story. There's no nursery.
Well, for many of young pupils, they actually start standard 1 without actually having going to the
goodness.
But it's something that's being rolled out. It's not at the, you know, at the par that we all want it to be. But it's slowly being rolled out.
All right. Yeah. Now tell me about university and your studies. What were some of the challenges you faced as a young woman studying, trying to get to university, but then also once you got to university, what were some of the hurdles you encountered as a young woman in those days to try and also, especially when you were sort of working against the opposite sex, particularly in a field like yours in law? I'm sure the majority were male. I imagine.
Yes, definitely. I think if I remember well, we were 6 of us. The class might have had around 26, maybe 27. I think we're 6 girls. So already it was, and that wasn't strange. I think in all, I remember even the next year in front of us, there were like 3 girls, and the rest of them were boys. So it was a very male-dominated profession, even starting from Chancellor College. I believe it still is, even if we look at the numbers now, but I think it's going up. So, but then I think the difference had been that for me, I just knew from an early stage, I said, I am going to be a lawyer. And I just never, you know how people say, no, I wanted to be an air hostess. No, for me it was like, I want to be a lawyer. So when I went for first year, I was actually chosen for Bachelor of Education Humanities. Yeah, and I was like, I want to be a lawyer. And people thought, oh, you just don't want to be a teacher. You're trying to run. And I was like, no, I just really want to be a lawyer.
But then that's besides the point. It was what you wanted to do.
Exactly.
So it didn't matter.
It didn't matter at all, you know. So I think I was just determined to say I need to get that average. I think at the time, I don't know if it was 63 or 65%, that average to get into that. And I just completely studied towards that goal. And we wrote the entrance exams as soon as we had gotten the average required for first year. and I got into it. And obviously, of course, the challenges will always be there. I think some of the challenges were obviously personal, because we didn't have a stable home, me and my brother at the time, and we were moving from one place to another, which could be was psychologically, would affect me.
Was your father still around at this
No, my
point?
father was not alive at the time. Yeah, so it was challenging at that time.
So you were being raised in different households.
Yes, for family, friends, and some of them were relatives. So I think that was the instability.
And that can't have been easy.
No, it wasn't. I mean, at some point, I remember that I was depressed, and I don't know how I got through from first year to third year. I always think it's kind of a blur. But then I think I was like, Chisomo, you've got to get your act together.
Yeah.
Because this is the pathway in which you not only get to evolve and get to a place where you need to be, but you can also get to help other people.
Yeah.
So I think at that stage I was like, I've got to get this done. So I don't want to paint it as if I was the star student every time everything was going on well. I think there were occasions where I just did not want to go to class, and I just wanted to wallow in grief and all that. But
how did you handle that? Because I think we're all faced with those moments, not just in education, but even once we graduate in the workplace, in the home setting, you sort of feel kind of defeated. Particularly as a woman. I think sometimes it's a bit more pronounced as a woman.
Yes.
For various reasons. How did you surmount that?
And I think you are right that when you say as a woman, it becomes more pronounced, because I feel like we do take on a lot. And at some point, I remember my brother used to say that now he tells me that I look at you and I thought like you just became mom, because I was trying to sort out things and figure out like how are we going to do this and all that. And I think that's too much for a child to take on board. And now I realize that going through psychological counseling and trying to heal through that kind of childhood trauma. So, but I think part of it was faith, not part of it, but a lot of it was faith. And I think one thing was my mother was a woman of faith, so she taught me how to pray very young. But that journey wasn't like, I think there were many times I would be like, but God, how could a good God do this? It doesn't make any sense to me. So it was a lot of time of questioning God and thinking like he's not there, and asking those tough questions. But then I think going to Chancellor College also exposed me to a lot of great people in SCOM, in CAPSO and all that, who just knew the word of God and helped to sail me through. So faith really was a great part of it. And I think just leaning on my brother, because we're just the two of us. And then I was like, okay, I can't let him down. He was the older one, but I just felt like I was more responsible for him, and trying to say I've got to do the best that I can so that we can sail through this together. So friendship, faith, having people just to hold you and having a vision to move towards really helps you to get through these very difficult times, I would say.
All right, we're going to take a short break. If you're just joining us, you're watching this week's edition of Women in the Fore, and today I'm talking to lawyer Chisomo Kaufulu, who works for the Titete Nkanza program through DFID in conjunction with the judiciary. Before we go to break, just to give you an update, she was telling us about her childhood. But when we come back, we're going to talk about how she got to be where she is today and how she climbed up the career ladder. Welcome back. You're watching Women in the Fore on Times TV with me, Wezi Kasambala, and I'm talking to lawyer Chisomo Kaufulu, who works for the Titete Nkanza program through the judiciary as the technical legal advisor or technical litigator. I keep getting that bit wrong. What is it, Chisomo?
It's technical. Okay, according to the contract, it's technical legal advisor.
Fantastic.
But litigator sounds cool.
I know, it sounds so much more illustrious.
Yes, it does.
Listen, Chisomo, before we went to break, you were telling me about university, trials and tribulations of university, your personal life as well. Now, once you actually graduated, how did that feel? You finally got your degree in law. Did you know the kind of law you wanted to pursue at that point?
Yes. At that point, I knew that I wanted to focus on human rights, and I knew I would just throw it around and say, oh, human rights. But I actually remember when we were doing our thesis in 4th year of law, and somebody, I think one of the teachers, and I think it was probably Professor H. Kanyungolo, who had said that, who's going to write anything on women's rights? And everybody said Chisomo. You know, I think from then everybody knew that I was so passionate about issues of women and girls' rights. And because by then, and even now, people look at it as a negative thing, like, oh, these feminists, they're just trying to do A, B, and C.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's a question of power. And I think people look at it, because obviously now we know we're in a patriarchal kind of setup, in which,
and we always have been, really.
We always have been. I don't even know why I'm saying now. It's always been like that. And where there's an issue of power, people kind of interpret it to say, oh, they want the power to shift from here to go to their other sex, you know, when it's not about that, when it's about ensuring that there's equal access to opportunities regardless of one's sex. So I remember saying, no, I'm not writing anything about women's rights.
But you did in the end.
No, I did, and that's the thing. I wrote something completely different, and I struggled with that thesis.
Oh no!
You know, because I was not true to my calling.
I was going to say, so did you
do their research? And I think I don't like to waste a lot of time trying to argue with people who have already made up their mind and they don't want to do their research. But if you want to do a simple Google of what feminism means, it's nothing to do with all that people talk about male bashing. In fact, we ain't got time to talk about that. What we want to make sure is that there are equal opportunities for the women and for the girl child, so that at the end of the day, of course, it's an end in and of itself, but at the end of the day, it makes a more equitable society that is able to develop.
Absolutely.
It's a benefit for everybody, but people want to look at it at a one-way kind of situation.
Okay, so what was your first job?
So my first job was working with the Malawi National Assembly under the mentorship of Mrs. Matilda Katopola, who then was the Clerk of Parliament. She's a lawyer as well. And I think we were the pioneers in terms of setting up the Legal Services Division. And my direct boss, I remember, was Mr. Masaugo Kakala, who is the Legal Aid Director. And then from there, I joined UNDP Malawi as a program analyst for access to justice. And I think that was now my exposure going into the development world. And it was there at UNDP Malawi that I actually realized I need to upgrade, because I realized there's so little I know, and I realized that when you look at things purely at a legal perspective, it doesn't give you the societal answers, because law doesn't operate in a vacuum, it operates in society, and you have to understand what's happening in society. And that's why we have so many high incidences of GBV. Doesn't need the law alone, there's also a societal implication that we have to try and address. So I did my master's at the University of Pretoria, where I did my master's in human rights, and then I also did a postgraduate diploma that was in Finland on the international protection of human rights.
Interesting. That's so random. Finland.
Yes.
That's so totally random.
It is.
But I love it. I think it adds an interesting touch to your resume.
Yes. And then when I came back, that's when I joined the Malawi Human Rights Commission. As a regional human rights coordinator.
How would you, having done your postgraduate diploma from in a country like two complete polar opposites, South Africa with such a huge incidence of gender-based violence, then you have a Scandinavian country which has such a low rate of crime, completely low. How did you reconcile the two?
And I think that's
how did that add to your...
Yes, and I think that's when I became very cognizant around social and cultural norms and issues of how these shape negative and toxic masculinities in terms of how we raise our boys, and in terms of how our boys...
And then watching this, like, wow, negative toxic masculinity.
Exactly, and that includes things like boys do not cry, you know, because negative masculinity is not just about boys, you know, perpetuating violence against women and girls, but it's also about things like boys shouldn't do this because they're boys, you know. If a boy wants to cry and express his emotions, let him do that. And if he wants to do ballerina, let him do that, you know.
If he wants to wear a tutu,
let him do that, you know. So it's really, I find it positive even for the men themselves. But I think the issue is really how even the young boys see how their mothers are treated and how the men are acting in society, and how they absorb that and then end up doing that, which I see is different from the... I'm not saying it's not a problem in Finland, but I can see how girls and boys are raised and how that shapes them up in society to look at each other as somewhat as equals, because I think the gender equality issue is not necessarily perfect everywhere.
Now let's bring it home. Now you are working on the Tetetse Cancer program. Tell me a bit more about that and what specifically your role is.
So my role is to provide technical advice to the Malawi judiciary on issues regarding gender-based violence, and basically it moves from research, but as well as following up on particular cases of gender-based violence and how to strengthen the response of the Malawi judiciary on these kind of issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when we look back at 2020, I mean, I say this all the time, 2020 was a particularly grim year when we think about gender-based violence, particularly for young girls. We saw a very high rate of rape, defilement of young girls. Some have blamed it on things like the fact that kids were not going to school, etc., etc., because of the lockdown and COVID. What's your perspective on this? How are we doing?
We're not doing well. The rate, the incidences are still unacceptably high, and we have seen that was a 35% increase in just rape case.
That was last year alone, right?
That was last year alone, right? So that means the rates have definitely gone up, and the rates that I'm talking about as being unacceptably high, I'm referring to the Demographic Health Survey of 2015-2016, because we don't have the latest one yet.
Why is that? Why are we failing to get access to such important data?
Well, I think maybe it could be an issue of resources and funding. I think even to do the DHS, it's not just the National Statistical Office and government. A lot of donors are pulling their funding to get that to happen, because it's a national-wide survey. Right. We do have snapshots of what's happening in particular districts depending on who's working where, but the DHS is always very important, because then you have that national level data. Right now, if you want national level data, you can still get it from the police, which they can tell you, but the fact is that's only reported.
Right.
And the DHS helps us to get the unreported data, and you know, half of women who experience gender-based violence don't report it. Exactly. Yeah.
So how is this impacting your work on the ground? The fact that there aren't enough statistics, but also cases are not being reported. I mean, surely that must be an impediment to any kind of progress on that front.
And I think even just to talk about the reported, the half that are reporting, of that half, only 10% will report to the police. So 40% are reporting elsewhere. Where it's
where?
Like the informal structures, like the chiefs, the religious leaders, the uncles, and the aunties.
Is that bearing any fruit?
Well, in most cases, it's the challenge with gender-based violence is that when you just say go and mediate and go back, and then things are going to be resolved, it doesn't necessarily always work that way. In most cases, and you expose the woman to more harm, because the violence will most likely continue. So I think it's very important that we actually work on both fronts, working with the informal but also the formal system. And I always say the informal ones, since women trust them more, maybe because they're nearer, and maybe because they can speak the same language and understand each other. We need to work with them that they can do better referrals and say, I know you came to me, but this is a serious incident. Can I escort you and accompany you to report this formally to the court or to the police, and so on and so forth.
Now, you talked about how the law doesn't operate in a vacuum, and we have to take into consideration so many other factors, socio-economic structures, etc., etc. To what extent is your program using that kind of information about our cultural dynamics to perhaps help in the fight against gender-based violence?
I think the beauty about this program, the Tetekaza program, is that it has two initiatives, which is the prevention and then the response side of it. And I'm more at the response side. But there's a whole prevention component in which we're trying to go through a socialization process to challenge these negative social norms that allow violence, especially against women and girls. So it's a conversation that doesn't happen today because you're on a loudspeaker and you're saying, no, you really have to sit down in small groups and begin to challenge those stereotypes using community structures. And that's a process that's not going to happen in a month or two, but eventually, gradually, we hope we can get there if we can sustain that conversation using our gatekeepers like chiefs and religious leaders to be at the forefront. Yes.
In your experience, when you have taken this matter to these, for example, traditional leaders, etc., etc., what's the reception like?
I think the reception so far is progressively becoming good. I mean, it hasn't always been good, but definitely it's progressively getting there, and we're seeing how we can partner with traditional leaders in terms of like child marriages. I think we have good examples around that. But for them as well, we have to understand that this is something in which they have grown up in, and for them, they're also grasping it. So there's also a lot of self-reflection and learning that they're doing on their end as well before they can begin to impact. Yes.
Now, in terms of what about, okay, you said you deal more with response. By response, are we referring more to how we deal with the case once it's reported, it gets to the police, or how we now handle this issue holistically? So, for example, do you follow through with individual cases to see where they end up?
That's very important when you talked about holistic, because I've realized that when my focus is solely about the court dispensing justice, for me, if somebody who's raped somebody else and physically assaulted them in the process and they get 20, 50 or 30 or 40 years, that's a win. But it's not always a win for the survivor.
That's my point, because I've recognized that a lot of the times when we're having this discussion generally about gender-based violence, we don't really seem to focus enough on the welfare of those victims. So all these little girls, for example, who we've heard about who've been raped, who is following up on how they're doing, even their actual health, who is doing that? Is this a component of the work that you do?
We do have a small fund which we call the Survivor Support Fund, which I wish it was big, but it's small, in which it provides small kind of support of funds to help survivors, kind of like when they're seeking help, to look at the other welfare issues, whether it's economic empowerment and whether it's psychosocial counseling. So I've been able to see like a survivor collapse in court just after testifying because of how overwhelming it is. And even though the accused person was convicted, they're thinking about, how do I pick up my life? Where do I start? And we've been able to support that through psychosocial counseling. But there's a lot that needs to go towards economic empowerment and helping them restart their life, whether it's taking them to a different school and just not where everybody's pointing at them, especially now with social media, and you have people circulating pictures all over the place. So we're now starting rolling out economic empowerment program. But obviously it needs to be a bigger effort. And I don't think that this is going to be sufficient. I think we need, as GBV practitioners, we need to look at this holistically, as you said, and I agree with that.
Now, if we look at another element, sentencing, for example, that's another it's been a big issue. Last year we saw some marginal improvement in terms of the kind of penalties that were being handed down, but still I think that it leaves a lot to be desired.
Definitely.
I don't know again to what extent you are able to influence that in terms of how we actually deal with the perpetrators as part of the response, because I think we also need to have some form of a deterrent, don't we?
Yes, definitely. And I think I have to give it to the media who kept on raising these kind of issues and talking about rape. I think that also kind of gave undue indirect pressure to look at the issues around sentencing. Now conversations with the judiciary are kind of like are going to a developed stage in terms of having more pronounced sentencing guidelines, particularly on sexual offenses, because we're seeing this disparities, 8 years and you have somebody else 30 years and all that. So that's kind of trying to help to address that. Of course, on the other hand, they always say that each case is different, and they look at several things and they say this was aggravating, so we have to add more, or this was so on and so forth. By the end of the day, I think we are realizing that for rape, for instance, the death penalty is actually the maximum sentence, and for defilement, I think it's life imprisonment.
And that already seldom see that though.
That already sends a picture that this is a serious offense. So if it's at 8 years when you have the maximum that low, and then there's this gap, I think obviously we see that there hasn't always been a tendency to treat it as a serious offense, and this needs to be addressed. So what I can assure you right now is that it's a conversation that's actually happening, and the Office of the Registrar has been very receptive in terms of looking at the issues of sentencing and developing good practice which can be circulated. Sometimes, of course, it can happen that because it's a lower grade magistrate, they're not able to give an enhanced sentence.
Oh gosh,
but they
don't even get me started on that one.
But
don't even get, because we've seen examples last year where the cases were then passed on to the High Court, and then the High Court judge hands out 50 years. So my argument has always been, look, at the end of the day, if we're saying these magistrates are not empowered enough to be able to give anything beyond, I don't know, 15 or 20 years, then perhaps why are we not seeing more cases being handled by the High Court? But then the response is, but then that means the High Court would be inundated and overwhelmed with cases of defilement and rape. Okay, and lastly, Chisomo, obviously you must be a very, very busy lady indeed, but I imagine you also have another side to you. You must have perhaps a lighter side to you. What do you do in your spare time?
In my spare time, aside from wrestling with my 3 toddlers.
You have 3 toddlers?
I do have 3 toddlers, and with homeschooling,
Oh my goodness. Wow.
But I love...
So what ages are those?
That's 7, 5, 1.
Okay. Yes. Oh wow, you've got a 1-year-old. I can empathize. I have a 1-year-old, so I know what that's like. Yeah,
but I love reading, and I definitely, not that I'm reading legal books, no, I'm reading a good novel, and I love a good comedy as well, just something to take my mind over all the things that are happening.
How do you balance having to raise 3 young children and also keep afloat a very, very demanding job, obviously?
I do that by accepting that I cannot do everything, and I think a lot of women think like, oh, let me be the superwoman, and then they're so overwhelmed, and then they have so much need inside because they're neglecting themselves. So how I balance it is accepting that I cannot do everything, and I need to have a partner that recognize that. So if I'm not home, he's got to be home, and if he's not home, I've got to be home. Sharing the workload, having a strong support system to keep me sane.
Yeah.
And to make sure I have my me time. Yes.
And finally, what are your aspirations for yourself, career-wise?
Okay.
As a career woman.
This year, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you up, but this year I'm saying I need to go for my PhD.
Okay.
Yes, I definitely want to do that because I want to know more and contribute more towards women and girls with disabilities.
Right.
As I was working on GBV, I recognize that they are also going through a lot in terms of gender-based violence. And I want to learn more about that and see how I can contribute. And so I've kind of come up with a research proposal on that, and I hope that eventually it gets accepted so that I can actually do that and come back to Malawi. Coming back, definitely.
Well, hopefully when you're finished, you can come back and tell us about that and how that went. Listen, Chisomo, it was such a pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you.
These are the kind of stories that we love to tell here on Women in the Fore, but we're going to have to leave it there. A big thank you to Chisomo Kaufulu for sharing her story as a lawyer, as the technical legal advisor for the Titetsen Kanza program, which works in conjunction with the Malawi judiciary. We'll be back, of course, next week with another fantastic power lady. Until then, from me, Wezika Sambala, it's bye-bye.